So welcome again to the GHGA webinar today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Today we have Andreas Bruns with us, and the topic is genetic discrimination. If you want to stay tuned and know more about GHGA and what's happening and our events, you can scan the QR code here and stay informed. Well, maybe I should explain who we are for those of you that are new and join for first time the webinar. So we are the German Human Genome-Phenome Archive. And our mission is to deliver and maintain platform for human omics data sharing, and everything what we do, we're doing in compliance with the GDPR. And in doing so, we hope to contribute to the secondary use of clinical omnis data in research. And of course, we can do it alone. There are diverse communities involved. So we are computational biologists, molecular geneticists, clinicians, scientists, physicians, and of course, patients. And this is the reason we try to organize different kind of events to get all the communities involved and contribute to communication and sharing knowledge and discussing the topics we are interested in. That's the reason I want to make you aware or to announce our next event. So next week, we will have our lecture series and next episode of our lecture series. And the topic is, how do you train genomics AI? So if you are interested in, please sign up. You can sign up in our webpage. And the next webinar next month in December, it's about benchmarking and quality control for genomic variant calling with Johannes Costa. So also please feel free to sign up. You can find already the information on our webpage. And now I would like to introduce our speaker today, Andreas Bruns. He studied philosophy and German studies, and got his PhD in philosophy and ethics in the University Leeds, and he's currently postdoctoral researcher in the National Center for Tumor Disease in the University of Heidelberg. And since May 2021, he is working in the work stream LC of GHGA. So he's member of GHGA. It's a pleasure for me to have you and to introduce you, Andreas. And yeah, so I hand over to you. Thank you very much for being here and share your work with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Vanessa. Thanks everyone else for coming today and joining us. Let me just share my screen. Yeah, as everyone at these days, I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm going to be sipping my tea. I hope that's okay, and hope that my voice will be holding up. Yeah, so today we'll be looking into a kind of global or globally relevant issue. It's the issue of genetic discrimination. And as the name suggests, that's a form of discrimination that is based on genetic characteristics of a person or genetic knowledge about a person, anything concerning a person's genotype. Yeah, it's a reported issue in many different areas. We come from the healthcare and research setting, but it's also an issue in employment and education and in lots of other areas, as we will see. And as we will be diving into the question what genetic discrimination is and how we should understand genetic discrimination, these are the things that we're going to cover. So we're first going to look at two different concepts of discrimination, a kind of morally neutral concept and a morally laden or a moralized concept of discrimination, as it's important to distinguish between these two. Then we're moving into the history of genetic discrimination as a term and a concept by looking at how the concept was introduced in the 90s by Paul Billings and his colleagues, and look at the popular asymptomatic definition of genetic discrimination. And then in the third part, we will move towards a broader understanding of genetic discrimination by looking at a couple of cases, real-world cases, that cast or shed some light on how genetic information can become a means or can become involved in broader discriminatory practices. And then in the last part, in the fourth part, we also want to address the question how what we can do about genetic discrimination. We'll look into some law and policy approaches and especially discuss what the challenges today are in addressing the problem of genetic discrimination. So coming to the first part, central to the concept of discrimination is, of course, the notion of treating people differently. This is or aligns with the Latin origins of the word discriminare, literally meaning to make a distinction or to distinguish between. But it's pretty clear that genetic discrimination can't just mean to treat people differently on the basis of genetic characteristics, because we do that a lot, for example, also in precision medicine. If you think about an example, let's say there are two patients who both have some form of breast cancer, and genetic tests are being done to see which kind of treatment will or is likely to be most effective in these two cases. The patients might be treated differently on the basis of that, but that's of course not an issue of discrimination, because it's in the interest of both patients to do that. So what is also central to the notion of discrimination or the concept is the notion of disadvantage. So we're not just treating people differently, but we're doing so thereby creating a disadvantage for them. Or discrimination means to pick out someone for differential treatment that is to their disadvantage. And this already kind of implies that genetic discrimination or discrimination in general is a normative concept, but it doesn't yet mean that it is a moralized concept, because we can, of course, treat people differently and create disadvantages for some of them without that being morally problematic. Think, for example, of what is sometimes called positive discrimination or also positive action. These are measures that basically help or are supposed to enable traditionally disadvantaged groups, for example, women in academia or so, to minimize those disadvantages. For example, an employer might give preferential treatment to applications from people from an underrepresented group. And this is usually not considered discrimination, or in a bad sense, it's considered something that is good. It's considered to be leveling the playing field due to some already existing social injustice. So if we speak about discrimination in that context, it's clear that we're not talking about something that's in itself wrong. So we're using a non-moralized concept of discrimination. We're saying positive discrimination is a thing only if discrimination doesn't have to be morally bad. But these are really niche cases, because usually in both in normal language and in political discourse, if we talk about discrimination, we usually mean something that's in itself wrong. So we use the concept in a moralized way. When we say someone has been discriminated against, then we usually include a moral judgment in that. We mean that they have received something like an unfair or a disadvantage that can't be morally justified. And in that sense, discrimination is always in and by itself wrong if we use that moralized concept. And so I'm just wanting to point out that while we often use the moralized concept, there is this non-moralized concept that is still being used sometimes. And it's important that every time we talk about or think about discrimination, we are aware whether we're using the non-moralized concept or the moralized concept. And as an example, positive discrimination, if we use the moralized concept, doesn't exist because discrimination is in itself bad and can't be positive or morally acceptable. Now, the concept of genetic discrimination was introduced or popularized by Paul Billings and his colleagues in 1992 in a paper that's called Discrimination and the Consequences, or Discrimination as a Consequence of Genetic Testing, that appeared in the American Journal of Human Genetics. And Billings and his colleagues argued that genetics would have a possible negative effect by introducing a really new kind of threat, by introducing a new kind of way to discriminate against people that's related on or is related to their health. And to see what they were after, let's look at two cases and compare these two cases. So in the first case, there's a person, John, who has some kind of disability and sits in a wheelchair. And John is applying for a lecturer position at a university. And behind closed doors, the decision is made to not give the job to John, but give the job to someone else, because working with John would require making some kind of additional and also laborious arrangements to account for his disability. So this is a paradigmatic case of a kind of discrimination on the basis of disability. And John does not get the job because he is disabled and because his disability makes it in some way inconvenient for the people to work with him. In part, that's actually like a rational kind of concern of those people, because just imagine, for example, that the university building is not accessible and it doesn't have an elevator. It doesn't really have classrooms that are in any accessible areas or so. That means employing John would really require a lot of financial and also other kinds of efforts for him even to be able to get around and for them to be able to work with him. So yeah, if this is the basis of discrimination, then we're talking about John here being picked out for disadvantaged treatment on the basis of his disability. Now let's look at the other case. That's a case about, both of these cases are fictional, I just made them up, but they are certainly something that has happened and maybe still happens in some parts of the world in practice. And in the second case, we have Kate. Her father has Huntington's disease. And let's suppose that Kate is applying for the same job as John. And she also doesn't get the job because the decision is made to give the job to someone else due to fears that Kate might at some point also develop Huntington's disease. And then if she does, that she won't be able to work any longer. And again, of course, picking out Kate for disadvantaged treatment is wrong and is a matter of discrimination. But there's a significant difference between these two cases, and that's the difference that Billings and his colleagues were after. And the difference is that Kate, unlike John, of course, isn't disabled, and she also isn't sick. She doesn't have a disease or so. It's only that the fact that her father has Huntington's disease means that there's a 50% chance that she will also develop it. And if she develops it, then yes, it's true that it will have a large impact on her ability to keep working. So this is the difference that Billings and his colleagues were after. The difference is that genetics or genetic information, genetic knowledge about people or about the possibilities of future health states really enables a form of discrimination that's not based on any visible features. Genetics allows us to treat people as if they were ill, even if they are not, even if they don't have any symptoms, and even if it's unclear if they will ever exhibit any symptoms. And Billings and his colleagues introduced the category of the asymptomatic ill to talk about the target category of people who genetic discrimination can happen to. So basically, we're talking about people who are not ill, who don't have a disease, don't have a disability, but because genetics allows us to gain knowledge about their future health state, it makes it possible to discriminate against them, even if they don't have any visible features of disease or disability. Now, this account, the asymptomatic account, as you might call it, has been super influential. So in laws and policies following that, genetic discrimination has often been, if not defined, then at least like focused on the asymptomatic ill and the question how we can protect asymptomatic individuals from this kind of treatment. And it really implies that genetic discrimination as a concept is limited to that category of people. There are lots of examples of that form of genetic discrimination that have been reported on, as I said. It's not just in the healthcare or context, but also in the employment context that we've seen in the examples, but also, for example, in insurance, where the concern is that people might that insurance companies might require people to pay more in terms of premiums because they have some kind of precondition that's revealed through genetic testing. They might even require previous genetic tests. That's one worry. There are worries in education and sports, immigration, and so on. So it's an issue that comes up in lots of different areas of public and private life. We actually published a paper earlier this year, colleagues from the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, where we look a bit more into the many different ways in which genetic discrimination can appear or occur in those different areas, especially of public life. There's also but we also argue in that paper that we have good reasons not to limit the definition of genetic discrimination to asymptomatic cases, because the issue itself is so has so many facets that to capture them, it's really important to also think about how genetic discrimination can concern other types of or other groups, other types of people. And another book here that's interesting, if you're interested in reading up on this more, is Thomas Lemke's Perspectives on Genetic Discrimination from 2013. And we can't really go into that in any more detail today, but just let me mention a couple of reasons why we might think that it's better not to limit the scope of the definition of genetic discrimination to just asymptomatic cases. One reason is, of course, that it seems a bit strange to say that someone can suffer from genetic discrimination or discrimination based on genetic characteristics, and then as soon as they start exhibiting symptoms, they that kind of possibility disappears. So it seems to be totally possible to discriminate against someone on the basis of genetic characteristics, even if they have symptoms or even if they have visible features that can also be the basis of discrimination. So this is something that we will also see in a bit when we discuss some more cases. The other reason is that if we think about genetic discrimination as some kind of special form of discrimination that slowly concerns the asymptomatic ill as a category, then I think we might be submitting to an unacceptable form of genetic exceptionalism. And that's a term that was coined by Thomas Murray, who's a bioethicist, and was also involved in the ELSI group of the Human Genome Project in the 90s. And he introduces that concept of genetic exceptionalism to mean the idea that genetic information is so distinct in concept, practical implications, and moral import that it deserves to be singled out from other types of health-related information. So that there is something about genetic information, that it has some properties that basically launch it into some unique universe of moral, legal, and policy concerns. And many people have argued against this idea and have argued that, for example, it's not even so easy to define genetics. And even if we manage to define what genetics is, then it's not so clear how we are to distinguish between genetic and non-genetic information or factors. Genetic exceptionalism also creates this dangerous and false idea or image that other kinds of information about our lives aren't as sensitive or aren't special and can't be like the basis of similar forms of discrimination and so on. So there are many reasons to reject this kind of exceptionalism. And it does make sense, I think, in the end, not to try to understand genetic discrimination as an isolated and somehow exceptional form of discrimination, but to try to understand rather how different forms of discrimination are tied together and relate to one another in a society like ours, where science is, or where a lot of, in a knowledge-based society, basically. And to try to better understand the many ways in which genetics can come to play a role in discriminatory practices. So we'll try to do that now and move towards a bit of a broader understanding of genetic discrimination and the scope of genetic discrimination. And I want to look at two real-world cases here that are really telling. The first one is the Maori warrior gene case that you might be familiar with. For those who aren't, I will just summarize the case. So basically, there is a gene, the MAOA gene, that's also sometimes called the warrior gene, and that has been associated with violence and some other forms of antisocial behavior. That already happened before, but then in 2006, New Zealand researchers have claimed that they could show in a study that there was a high frequency of that gene in the indigenous Maori population in New Zealand. And briefly summarized, I think the research claimed that the gene, so it was an evolutionary kind of research, that claimed that the gene had been positively selected in the history of the Maoris by through the like violent and risky migrations of their ancestors across the Pacific. But the thing is that the research also stated that the high frequency of that gene in the Maori population could explain the high rates of crimes and other kind of violent acts among the Maori population today. So I think quite astonishingly, this case has sometimes been referenced as a case of bad science communication, as if the problem would just be that of how scientists are to communicate research to the public. Or so, but I think actually the science here is not even the issue. I think, as far as I understand, the science behind this all has been questioned as well. This paper here by G.R. Hook from 2009 suggests that the Maori do not actually have that warrior gene that would make them, in any sense, more violent or something. But as I said, whether the science behind all of this is bad or good is not even the issue here. I think the issue clearly is that this is a case where genetics is used to pick out a minority population, the Maori, as people who are particularly violent. and that this is basically just introducing genetics into the pre-existing racist narratives, because obviously, the belief that the Maori and other indigenous groups or people are more savage or violent or cruel, or so that those kinds of beliefs, of course, pre-exist the research or predate this kind of research, and they come from a long history of colonial nations trying to brand indigenous people as such. And to a large part, that branding, of course, is also motivated by the desire to justify colonial crimes. For example, the genocide of indigenous people, or displacing them from their lands. So one article, an online article from the Genetic Literacy Project, says it nicely when it says that this kind of research just gives a pseudoscientific gloss to racist beliefs. And of course, the thing is that there are a lot of factors that contribute to high crime rates and to violence within communities. And many of these factors, of course, will be social factors. They will have to do with poverty, with marginalization and exclusion from social life, lack of education, and also chances to access education and so on. So it's a matter of what's happening here is a matter of using genetics to pick out the Maori people as particularly violent, and this way bind them to a certain inferior place in society, basically shifting blame away from society and from governments that fail to produce those equal chances to something that's genetically determined. So let's talk about another case that illustrates similar things, and that's the case of the Havasupai tribe, that you might also be familiar with. Again, if you're not, I will summarize the case quickly. So basically in the early 90s, members of the Havasupai tribe, which lives in the Grand Canyon in Arizona, they provided DNA samples for research into the genetic causes of diabetes. They also had some interest in doing that because diabetes is a prevalent disease affecting their community. And in 2003, some of these members were listening in to a student's doctoral presentation. And during that presentation, they learned for the first time that the DNA had also been used for other studies. And some of these studies were about the genetic origins of the Havasupai people, who themselves believe that they originate from that area where they also live. And basically, that research suggested that genetically speaking, at least, the Havasupai people would not originate from Arizona. And now you might have heard this case because it's the historical case that gave or that caused the Navajo Nation, which is the largest reservation of Native American people in the USA, to ban genetic research. And again, here the issue is not whether the genetic research in question is scientifically sound or something. It may well be, of course, that genetically speaking, the Havasupai people do not originate from Arizona. They have, however, I think, been living there for like at least 800 years. One issue, of course, is that the studies have been done without the knowledge or consent of the people who provided their DNA. So they didn't know that this kind of research would be done with the data. But also, this is not the whole issue. Consent isn't the whole issue. There's a long history of colonialist nations trying to displace indigenous people, as I said before, from their lands. And especially the economic kind of interests in that do persist, as we see, for example, also in Canada with the tar sands, but also in the US. So the Havasupai, they, and I think understandably worry that this kind of genetic research could be used as a means to justify displacing them from their lands, because it can somehow undermine the claims that they have to their lands by undermining their traditional beliefs, and also undermining the claim that they have some kind of special relationship to the lands that we're talking about. So I think like the warrior gene case, this case shows that genetics can become a vessel for many different forms of discrimination, not just on the basis of disease or disability, but also, like in this case, racial discrimination that's based on genetic information about the origins of a people. Now, before I come to the last part of the talk, I want to pause here and take stock of kind of what we've learned so far, what these cases suggest about how we should understand the concept of genetic discrimination. I think the first important point is that genetic discrimination seems to be intersectional. So it doesn't just concern health, and it also doesn't just concern genetics. Genetic information can pertain to a lot of things that are not just health related. And also, as we've seen here, genetic discrimination can interact with different other kinds of discriminations. For example, racial, gender, or whatever kind of discrimination. And one example, I think, for example, for a case where gender discrimination and genetic discrimination interact would be, let's say, an organization, a sports organization or so, using genetic information or characteristics about a person, about a person's biological gender, trying to undermine their claims about their gender identity. So, as I've said before, the same extent as genetics allows us to gain a deeper insight into people's biological life, it also allows our discriminatory practices to go deeper. The second point, I think, is that genetic discrimination is not a merely personal concern. So it doesn't just target individuals, and that's one of the problems in like lawmaking and policy making, because that's often focused on how individuals, for example, in the employment setting, can suffer from genetic discrimination. But it also importantly affects groups and communities. In fact, that isn't really surprising, because I think discrimination is never a solely personal concern. It always picks out someone as a member of a certain group for disadvantaged treatment. And in the same way, I think genetic discrimination picks out someone as a member of a certain genetically defined group, or as a carrier of a certain genetic trait for disadvantaged treatment. On a side note, maybe here, by group, of course, I don't mean that the people have to be organized in some way, or so. It's just a conceptual group that can simply exist because people share some kind of trait. For example, being Jewish, being women, and so on. And in this sense, I think discrimination is different from other kinds of moral offenses, in that the offense always extends to all other members of the group. For example, you can't discriminate against a Jewish person without at the same time discriminating against all Jewish people. It just extends to every member of the group who shares the relevant trait. And there's a concept by Joel Feinberg, who was an American philosopher, political and legal philosopher, the concept of profound offense, where that really captures that kind of, that what's special about these kinds of offensive. And one feature also of these profound offenses, according to Feinberg, is that they do not depend on someone being offended. So basically, of course, as in cases like the ones we've just discussed, the warrior gene case, for example, the research always causes a big backlash, of course, and thus communities speak up and complain and so on and are offended. But for the research of that kind to be offensive, it's not necessary even that someone in particular is offended. The idea is that these profound offenses are offensive even if no one is around to suffer from that offense. That's also, for example, if you make an anti-Semitic comment or so that is offensive, even if there's no Jewish person around who is offended by it. The third point I think that we've learned is genetic discrimination doesn't have to be based on bad science. It can be based on good science. Or as you will also read sometimes, especially in definitions or so, genetic discrimination can be rational or irrational, as it's said. So the question, as I said before, the question whether the science is good or bad or sound is usually a background issue. What's more important is how the science is used in the social context. But it is possible that genetic discrimination can be based on good or bad scientific standards, and it can be based on true scientific statements, and it can be based on false scientific statements. So, for example, if we go back to the Huntington's case, it's true that Kate has a 50% chance of developing Huntington's disease, and that if she does, then this will also have an impact on her ability to work. So it's rational in this case to discriminate against her on the basis of that. But imagine, for example, that her father didn't have Huntington's disease, but he was an alcoholic or so. At least, of course, there might be some relationship between alcoholism and our genes, but as far as I at least understand, it's not rational to assume that someone whose father was an alcoholic has, genetically speaking, a 50% chance of becoming an alcoholic themselves. So in this case, it would be irrational to discriminate against her by saying we don't want to employ her because she might become like her father, an alcoholic one day. And so common definitions of genetic discriminations in like legal and policy contexts, they often try to capture that by talking about not just genetic characteristics, but also presumed genetic characteristics. So they emphasize that the characteristics that the discrimination is based on can be real or presumed. Then the fourth point, I think genetic discrimination does not have to be intentional, nor does it have to be direct. It's also something that these two cases we discussed suggest. So for something to be genetic discrimination, it's not necessary that there's a clear intention to discriminate someone. Perhaps in the warrior gene case, it wasn't the researchers' intention to discriminate against the Maori. It might well have been, but we can also assume that it hasn't been. What matters is not the intention so much here, but the impact on the target community. So in this case, it was discrimination, even if it wasn't intentional. And often genetic discrimination and other forms of discrimination also don't occur directly through an individual action or so. They often occur as an outcome of a series of actions by different actors. So for example, researchers do this research where they claim they have found a genetic reason for violence in a certain population, and then law enforcement uses that information to, for example, to justify profiling or police brutality or something against that community. So I think for researchers, from a researcher's perspective, genetic discrimination is a lot about complicity. It's about the risk of becoming complicit in pre-existing discriminatory practices. And the last point, which is maybe a bit of a you don't say point, is the conceptual and practical relationships between genetic discrimination and other forms of social injustice are complex. So for example, we might have an idea that genetic discrimination somehow relates to things like stereotyping, marginalization, oppression, and so on, but it's a difficult question or a complex set of questions how these relations are actually to be spelled out. Just to name one example here, there's a book by Iris Young that's called, I think, Justice and the Politics of Difference from the 90s. And Young argues that we should always understand discrimination as something that pertains to the actions of individuals or organizations or states or something, but is always traceable to behavior and actions. Whereas something like oppression, for example, is a systematic or a systemic structural worry in that it is all about the outcomes that are routinely generated by the structural and institutional framework of a society. So in that sense, genetic discrimination can contribute to oppressive structures, for example, but itself is always reducible to actions of individuals or organizations. Okay, I'm coming to the last part where I wanted to talk a little about the question how we can address genetic discrimination as a global problem and what the challenges are to doing so. So the map that you see here is it shows the different law and policy approaches that states have taken worldwide to address and prevent genetic discrimination. And it's from the website of the Genetic Discrimination Observatory. That's a global network of researchers and institutions that also has a connection to the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health that I mentioned before. And this map is one of different resources that they have on their website. And one other resource that's interesting and worth mentioning is there's a website space where you can share your story. So basically, if someone believes that they have been the victim of genetic discrimination or they know someone who has, they can share that story online, and they are then tracked and evaluated. Okay, so back to the map. The map shows that in some parts of the world, these are the ones in dark blue, like North America and many parts of Europe. There are specific laws, national laws in place that target genetic discrimination. In Germany, for example, we have the Gendiagnostikgesetz from 2010 that aims to mitigate the risks associated with human genetic testing. And one of the things that law states is that, for example, employers and insurance companies may not require genetic testing from potential employees or people asking for insurance, nor may they ask for existing or to see existing test results. In some parts of Europe, these are the ones in purple, in the middle. There are no specific laws about genetic discrimination, but they have ratified the Convention on Human Rights in Biomedicine or some other document that prohibits genetic discrimination. In yet other parts of the world, the yellow ones, for example, there are no laws, but some other kind of binding instruments or documents exist. And the ones in brown are those that have just administrative regulations in place about genetic testing, so that not everything can be done in genetic testing or with genetic tests, and so on. Yeah. And it's also visible from the map, though, that many parts of the world, these are the ones in gray, like in large parts of Africa and in Russia and Asia, there are neither laws, specific laws, nor other kinds of regulations or policies in place about genetic discrimination, at least as of yet. And one of the really global challenges, I think, of addressing genetic discrimination is that because the flow of data and also of genetic data more and more transcends the national borders or the borders of states, we have to address these kinds of issues on a global scale. And that's really challenging if there's so little efforts in some parts of the world to address genetic discrimination, or if there don't exist any documents on that. Now, some of the other challenges are if we want to address genetic discrimination in laws, so through national laws, One major challenge is that laws, of course, they always need to be specific. They need to be specific enough to be actionable or applicable. So laws generally need to use narrower definitions of things and clearly state the conditions under which they are applicable. And that's one of the reasons why many laws focus on the discrimination of individuals in certain public life contexts, for example, education or employment. But this, of course, also means that it's practically impossible, or let's say very hard, to create national laws that do capture all of these different facets of a problem like genetic discrimination. And this is why sometimes it might make sense to take an alternative soft law approach. So I don't think there's any accepted or broadly accepted definition of soft law, but it basically just means putting social or moral norms into place by some other means than laws. So, for example, through international documents like human rights conventions. And for example, that's also being done in the Universal Declaration of the Human Genome and Human Rights, for example, from 1997. It says that the human genome underlies the fundamental unity of all members of the human family, as well as the recognition of the inherent dignity and diversity, and no one shall be subjected to discrimination based on genetic characteristics. Of course, the problem here is then that the definitions are very broad, if a definition is even given. And so that when we take the soft law approach, it's very hard to make that actionable. For one thing, the broader scope of the definitions makes it hard to apply those kinds of principles to specific cases. On the other hand, the problem is that the soft law approach isn't backed by the same institutional enforceability. So someone who violates a national law, for example, can go to prison, but someone who violates a declaration won't go to prison unless they also violate some kind of national or international law, and mostly a national law, because international law is also hard to enforce, as we've seen recently as well. So, and a third kind of challenge to addressing genetic discrimination is, I think, posed by new emerging genetic technologies, for example, in epigenetics, polygenic risk scores, and DNA methylation. I'm not a geneticist and don't have the expertise to talk about these with much confidence. But I take it that the potential of these kinds of technologies, both in addressing but also contributing to genetic discrimination, is still very poorly understood. For example, I found some interesting epigenetic studies on the relationship between experiences of discrimination on the one hand and genetic changes on the other hand, something suggesting that experiences of discrimination can lead to changes in stress-related genes, for example. And to me, this sounds really significant, but also potentially worrying, because it sounds like giving social stigma a genetic footprint, and whether this is something that's useful because it's identifying even further negative consequences of discrimination, or harmful because it helps that discrimination to go deeper and basically fix our ideas of social stigma, is, I think, a bit of an open question. And we are not, and we need to understand better how these technologies relate to genetic discrimination. This is one of the things that I'm very happy to talk about in the Q&A, because that's not where my expertise lies. But with this, I'm coming to an end, and here is a list of literature that I used. And thanks for your attention. And now I'm very happy to take questions and to hear more about your experiences and ideas. So thank you very much.